So, welcome back to the show. My guest today is Professor Felicity Deane. Professor Deane is from Queensland University of Technology, and she's a professor in international trade law, amongst other things. Welcome back, Felicity.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. We kicked off a few months ago with you on the show talking about the early days of the trade wars and the tariff wars, and there was at that stage a lot of uncertainty. In some respects, of course, there remains a lot of uncertainty, but at the beginning of August, I think we are starting to see some of the dust settle. A lot of people talk about the dynamics of the bilateral negotiations and who won and who lost, but perhaps we can focus a little bit more systemically on what some of the potential implications are. One of the ways in which people have commented on the United States' current approach to international trade is that it is going to turn the global system on its head. What do you make of that kind of observation? Do you think the global system is being turned on its head and being undermined and destroyed? Or, in fact, is something else going on?
I think it's probably the complete opposite, to be honest with you. I think it's
Mhm.
probably going to underscore the importance of having um, institutions that involve rules, that involve certainty, and that involve means for settling disputes that will actually have some more certain outcomes as a result. So at the moment, we are faced with some difficulties when we look at the World Trade Organization, for instance. The dispute settlement system is currently facing some challenges and it can't actually see any process through to the end at the moment. But like I said, I think this is really going to show all countries around the world the importance of having those rules and in using those rules to enforce outcomes. Because without them, international law is meaningless. And in fact, any agreements made between countries are meaningless. And so the question might be that without a World Trade Organization, without a system where there's rules and certainty, what is the point of entering into deals at all? Why not just have everything being transactional? And the answer is that it's incredibly inefficient and it's going to lead to a great deal of uncertainty if we don't have them.
Now, a country like Australia, of course, has been heavily reliant upon the presence of these multilateral institutions. You wrote a recent piece in the conversation, which we'll link in the comments below, about the beef case study. We touched on beef a few months ago, and you've dived into it again, really to illustrate some of these issues. Could you perhaps just walk us through the situation there and what the fundamental issues are, and perhaps use the case of beef to shed some light on the bigger picture questions?
Absolutely. So, obviously, Australia is one of the world's largest exporters of beef. We're the second largest exporter in the world of beef, just behind Brazil. And one of our biggest markets, of course, is the United States. The United States also happens to be the second largest importer of beef in the world. And so, when these tariffs were announced, one of the concerns was that this would make our beef products less competitive over in the United States because they were simply going to be more expensive for consumers, because that's how tariffs work, of course. It's not something that's paid by our exporting companies. It is paid usually entirely by the consumers in the country which is imposing the tariff. So US consumers would end up paying more for any Australian beef products. Hence, there was that concern that it would make Australian beef less competitive. However, of course, the tariff in Australia is only at 10%. And because very few nations have been spared with any US tariffs, it doesn't, in fact, make Australian beef significantly more expensive. In fact, it may indeed make it less expensive than some of their other products because they do not have a large enough domestic beef industry for their entire nation. So they can't feed everybody in the United States who wants beef with US beef. They're simply not enough. And so they have to get it from somewhere. And so that didn't cause any hiccups in our supply chain when it came to the beef supply chain. But it was interesting. So you'll recall that one of the things that was mentioned as being a non-tariff barrier to trade was perhaps Australian rules around the import of meat products into Australia. This was specifically mentioned by the US President in his speech, that Australia does ban the import of US beef into Australia, which was, of course, true, except for shelf-stable products. We did not import any US products into Australia. This was for biosecurity reasons, which is completely compliant with all trade rules and completely compliant with the US and Australia Free Trade Agreement. The fact that you can have biosecurity rules in place, there is nothing in international trade law that says you can't do that. There's, of course, economic reasons for this as well. Like I've just mentioned, Australia is a very large producer of beef. We export a lot of the beef here to other countries. And so we simply don't need to be importing beef from other countries. And so there's not really an economic reason to do so. And I certainly don't expect to see it on the shelves anytime soon, despite the fact that that ban that I've just mentioned has recently been lifted. That's just the rule around importing beef. It doesn't mean that we're going to see a lot of it on the shelves here. Because of that, there's no economic need for it.
One of the interesting things about all of this too is some of the feedback I've received from Australian beef exporters is that many of their contracts are denominated in US dollars, and with the devaluation of the US dollar, they've actually received a pay rise. So United States importers are not only having to spend more US dollars per kilogram, they're also having to pay the tariff on top. Kind of a bit paradoxical, really. But could we just go back to the WTO question? Because I think that many people often see what the US does ultimately dictates what happens around the world. And increasingly, it seems that the US, whilst it's still an important and a big economy, it's only 14% now of global imports, is no longer able to exercise the same kind of unilateral influence it once did over how the world as a whole works. And from what I can see, and correct me if I'm wrong, countries around the world seem to be doubling down on the WTO in a paradoxical kind of way for all of their own non-USA related trading interactions. And they're also hastening or accelerating their efforts to develop their own multilateral arrangements within the parameters or the umbrella of the WTO rules of the game. So rather than the system being turned on its head per se, the paradox is that the American economy is almost being positioned as a rogue, and everyone else is now being forced to reckon with the limitations of the system as it is, but actually make a greater effort to fixing it.
I think that's a very fair observation. So a couple of things you've pointed out there. The reliance on the system is completely true. And in fact, I have not checked the WTO website anytime in the last week, but I can tell you that a few countries did initiate disputes against the US in response to some of these new tariffs, simply because they're completely against all of these existing trade rules that we have had in place since the end of World War II. So that was the thing. Other countries have not given up at all on this system. In fact, they continue to rely on it. And that is going to be something that the US does have to participate in, unless they're going to withdraw from it entirely, which I doubt would be a very wise decision at all. So there is that. There are a number of countries that have initiated disputes. Now, there's many more countries that could have initiated disputes through the WTO, but there might have been a bit of a sentiment within certain countries, and I'm suspecting Australia might be one of these, where they don't think that this current tariff is going to have a significant enough impact to cause the ripples in relations with the US that a WTO dispute may result in. Now, it hasn't stopped us from initiating disputes against other trading partners in the past. Obviously, we've had a lot of those that have been initiated by Australia, but I think in this case, there may have been reasons to not do that. Obviously, it could be that there's not enough stakeholders complaining about what's been going on, because that's usually what drives these initiation of the disputes, is that you'll have these particular industry groups lobbying the government saying, look, this is really hurting us, these trade barriers. But I suspect in this case that hasn't actually happened. So that's the first thing. Second thing, yes, I think it's an incredibly important institution. Those rules that we've had in place for some time, I think we'll see those as being even more important moving forward. We saw what happened to financial markets when those rules were completely disregarded earlier this year by the US administration. Those financial markets went into a spin simply because there needs to be certainty for good commercial outcomes. And so I think that's also been something that's underscored the importance of them. And in terms of looking at some of these multilateral and bilateral negotiations, I think we've definitely seen that to be reinvigorated as a result of these recent actions. We've seen Australia and the EU re-entering into negotiations, for instance. Obviously, that was something that was going on a few years ago. Those negotiations ended up failing a number of years ago. They have been reinvigorated as a result of these decisions made by the US administration. And of course, we've seen the Australian Prime Minister recently travel to China and enter into some very fruitful discussions there about our ongoing relationship there. So, yeah, certainly interesting times.
This question of certainty also seems to be affected by a couple of other things. One is that the mechanism by which the tariffs have been imposed have been largely, not always, but sometimes via executive order on the basis that there is a national emergency, right? And that is testing the ways in which the American courts ultimately interpret this question of national emergency. And I think that there are still some outstanding court cases around that. The other thing is that a presidential term, of course, has 4 years, and there are midterm elections as well. And perhaps the uncertainty and the attitude of some nation states is to, in a sense, to ride all of this out and sit tight for 18 months and see how all of this happens. Any thoughts or comments on both those dimensions of this question of uncertainty?
Got a lot of comments on the first point, the national emergency. Obviously, these tariffs have been challenged in US courts. They were deemed to be illegal. That was the last time that I saw a court update. It was from the International Trade Court. I don't have the name of it exactly in front of me, but those judges did find there was no national emergency to be declared, which does align with what would be found, in my opinion, under WTO rules. So obviously we've got provisions or exceptions for national emergency, not only at the WTO level, usually in any other preferential trade agreement, there will also be provision for national emergency, and there's also provision for the president to be introducing tariffs for national emergency reasons in the United States. So in Australia, this is not something that could happen through a decision made by one person. It would have to go through the ordinary lawmaking process, whereas in the United States, the way that this has occurred is the president has declared a national emergency and as a result has been able to introduce these tariffs. That's simply the case. Is it is not a national emergency that's been declared. You can't declare a national emergency of this kind. It is usually more a short-term thing that is a national emergency, and it's usually about direct conflict of some concern, or it could be the potential threat of direct conflict. That's always been the understanding of national emergency. It's the understanding under international law as well. And so that's been the first problem with this. And you're absolutely right. That means whether these are actually going to stay in place for any period of time, there's a question around that. In terms of the US politics, look, it's difficult to predict how that's going to play out, and I'm certainly not going to try and do that. I'm not an expert in US politics, despite the fact that I have been watching US politics very closely. pretty much since the 2016 election, simply because of the outcomes there. This election result, I think, was it was a little bit of a surprise, and so predicting what's going to happen in the midterms, it's impossible to say. One would hope that there would be some feedback that perhaps the processes that have gone on, some of the decisions that have been made may not be the best way for the US administration to conduct themselves, but who's to say that that would actually occur?
Yeah. Well, I guess what that means for many, of course, around the world is to adopt a very similar wait and see attitude again, which feeds into this idea that that the uncertainty will persist for a while yet. One of the areas that's also of interest is the effect or perhaps the sort of non-effect of these tariffs, which have been applied in all sorts of different rates across just about all countries, how that's likely to shake out supply chains themselves. Part of the theoretical objective was to, in effect, penalise entire import supply chains so that domestic activity would emerge in the United States to fill the gap. It seems so far that in many instances that that's unlikely to happen, certainly in the short term. But do you think that there are likely to be, again, with this uncertainty as a backdrop, going to be substantial uh, adjustments to the spatial distribution of global supply chains? Are we going to see shifts in patterns and trends that have been evident for a while now, or do you think in a paradoxical or perverse kind of way, we're going to see a reinforcement of existing relationships?
Well, in response to that question, I'd say, is the US important enough to disrupt global supply chains? And that would probably be, would we look at things on a case by case basis? Would that potentially mean that certain industries, businesses would shift their operations to different countries to ensure they're paying low, or to ensure that their products attract lower tariffs? Let's use the correct words, because it's not the countries that are shipping or the exporting country that's shipping products there that's paying the tariff. So that would be the first thing I'd say, is that you'd have to look at this on a case by case basis. Personally, I think the thought of imposing they are different level tariffs, yes, and that could disrupt things slightly, perhaps if they're high enough and if the market is important enough, depending on the product. It could disrupt things. Is that going to mean that every single supply chain moves their operations to the United States in order to appease the US administration's requirements? It's just impossible. It's just not possible for that to happen. Certainly not possible for it to happen over the short term, and definitely not possible for it to happen over a longer period of time. It's going to make all of those products incredibly expensive to produce. And then, of course, the simple fact of the matter is there's not enough people there in order to be involved in all of these supply chains. And the conditions, depending on what we're talking about, like I've mentioned, the beef supply chain, for instance, you simply cannot breed enough animals or enough cattle in the United States in order to feed everybody within the United States, let alone to create, completely disrupt those supply chains. It's just not something that you can even turn your mind to. And so my answer to that is basically no, it's not going to disrupt the supply chains. It might have little blips within them, but I can't see it making drastic changes across, what's now, depending on the products, of course, completely complex. The way things operate, it's like this very, it's like a ballet or a symphony, the way it all works at the moment. Perhaps not. It's not always poetic. Perhaps it's not always beautiful, but it does work. Not perfect, of course, but the thought of it all shifting gives you pictures of basically tipping over a ship and making the whole thing sink.
One of the interesting things that I think has come out of this is a realization too that the nature of trade in the world has changed quite a lot in the last 30 years. And I'm speaking in particular of, broadly speaking, this issue of South-South trade, global South to global South trade, as opposed to old patterns of peripheral economies selling raw materials to, advanced centres who then sell value-added things back the other way. And in particular, one of the ways in which that seems to have emerged is the expansion of uh, trade within the Asia region itself as a case study, whereby intra-regional trade is now more than half of all the trade that Asian nations engage in. And again, this suggests that uh, as the United States becomes a more uncertain and difficult trading partner, for the time being at least, the time and effort that enterprises in the global south broadly conceived will go to is actually to boost south-south trade as opposed to figuring out what to do with the North American market. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's probably a more efficient way of doing things at the moment. I mean, obviously, yeah, we have seen some nations, attempt to enter into diplomatic relations with the US. So I wouldn't say we're completely just going to cut off the limb at this point. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I think they'll remain an important player when it comes to the global economy. But definitely the thought of looking beyond these traditional trading relationships, it's been something there's been a pattern of that, I want to say, over the last 20 years. So it's not something that's anything new, and this may exacerbate the speed with which those relations, are made between different countries. Having said that, there's some very good existing trade relations between those countries already. We do have a number of very significant trade agreements, RCEP being one of them. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was one of them, of course. We've got the group of ASEAN nations with some very strong and very solid agreements between them for trade. Now, these are agreements that have been brought into existence over a number of years. They're not something that you can enter into over a cup of tea or even several dinners. It's something that takes place over a number of years because the precision of those agreements is such that it really needs to be carefully scrutinised in order for them to take legal effect. And so you're absolutely right. But like I said, I don't think that it means that the US is going to be, entirely insignificant in the global economy. That would just be, impossible for us to say that because they are such a large market and they are such a large player. And I feel like predicting anything at the moment in the way we've facing things in terms of artificial intelligence and various other changes happening in the world, it's very, very difficult. And so I'm usually not inclined to say, well, I think this is what's going to happen because I just think there's so many things up in the air right now.
Look, certainly it's a period of incredible flux. Turning to these regional multilateral institutions like the RCEP, and of course there's the TCTPP and others. Could you perhaps shed a little bit of light on, firstly, their historic role, but perhaps their short-term future roles going forward in the context of the challenges of the WTO, particularly around dispute resolutions, and making amendments to WTO rules through the consensus mechanisms, and how these lower order multilateral arrangements, in a sense, fulfill that day-to-day practical need that countries have to have a clear but nonetheless flexible regime in which they can engage in trade with each other.
I could give you a really long answer to this question, but I'd probably forget all of the points that I need to make. But I'll start with this. So I think the existence of the WTO and the rules under the WTO have allowed for the development of all of these free trade agreements that, as you said, they're on a lower level. It just means they're between less partners, basically, between less nations than the WTO is. So the WTO, we've got, last time I checked, it was 160 something members of the WTO. And so one of the issues with an organisation like that, it's extremely powerful, of course, if you've got rules that are agreed to apply to every single one of those members, which is what the WTO intends to do. All of those rules are to apply to everybody. But if you need to make changes to those rules, or if you need to amend any of the processes, change any of the dispute settlement mechanism, it is extremely difficult because it's a everyone agrees or nothing changes situation there. It's a consensus mechanism where everybody has to agree to it. Otherwise, you do have to have these spin-off agreements either under the WTO or completely outside of it, although still, if you're a member of the WTO, you still have to comply with those WTO rules. So what the WTO has allowed us is to set up a bit of a, let's call it a framework for dispute settlements at that international level. We don't have any global police. We do have an International Court of Justice, but what the WTO has is a very clear dispute settlement process that means if you've got a problem with one of your trading partners, there's a means to settle disputes. You enter into negotiations, consultation process. If that doesn't resolve it, there's a panel that is established to make a decision as to whether there's been a breach of rules. That panel decision can be appealed, and of course it is the appeal process that has been disabled at the moment because of blocking of the panel members. But like I said, that's given us this framework that has been used in a lot of these other, you mentioned lower level, but just basically agreements with less trading partners as a part of it. And when you've got agreements with less trading partners, you can change things more readily because you've only got to get agreements between those trading partners. Not saying it's easy, certainly never easy to make changes to these trade agreements if you're going to do it properly. But at the same time, instead of getting consensus across 160 plus nations, you can be looking at, is it 15? Is it, that's one of the larger ones. Or is it just 2 nations that have to agree to make changes, which, like I said, can still take some time, but certainly does allow for more flexibility. And in an age where we're seeing things change at such a rapid rate, obviously, I mean, if you think back to what things were like in the 1980s and what things are like now, whether those rules can still be as powerful, there's questions around that. We need to make some new agreements around digital trade, for instance, because that's completely different than it used to be. And so coming to those decisions at a WTO level has been difficult, but at the same time, it does still allow for a place where those negotiations can take place. It can allow for a place where those big issues can be flagged. And of course, nothing stops these nations from having those negotiations on their preferential trade basis and showing how things could potentially be done. You mentioned the TPP. That's certainly given us a bit of a blueprint for how things could be done when it comes to digital trade, for instance. There's some provisions in there that are completely new that don't exist at the WTO level, and it's almost a bit of a, shall we say, a sandpit to see how things play out.
There's some interesting membership crossovers between some of these too, because from memory, Chile is a member of the CPTPP, right? And they've reached out to apply to become a member of the RCEP. And so it seems to me that if you visualize this as a series of networks, some of these countries obviously overlap each other in terms of memberships, and others will become conduits, if you will, for interactions between different networks. How do you see that kind of process perhaps unfolding insofar as the subordinate multilateral frameworks or agreements are concerned, as a way in which nations that remain committed to open trade can actually advance their respective and collective interests against the backdrop of the uncertainties we've been discussing?
Well, the answer is, I suppose, it really depends. And so we've got to remember that each agreement they're not unique. I was going to say each agreement is unique. So whatever you agree under one agreement, you don't necessarily have to agree under another one. You can have completely different terms and rules between different agreements. So that's a fact. So Australia is a member of a number of these agreements. their agreements under their rules and the processes under one may be completely different to under another. So it's not just that these are our terms and conditions for joining up. And so, we just bring all those with us. Each and every one is a different negotiation process, is why it takes so long. So you could say, well, this could become like a quasi WTO if you have everybody that's joining up to these different ones, and it's effectively this massive spider web of free trade agreements. Not necessarily the case, not quite as effective, doesn't provide the same amount of certainty, going to give trade lawyers significantly more to do trying to unpick what's applicable when. Each agreement's got different rules of origin, for instance, and if you want to start talking about the complicated little terms and conditions that accompany these agreements, the rules of origin, they scare me to look at because they can be so complex. And so I don't think it is going to be a quasi WTO, but it's certainly going to allow for these trade negotiations to continue, even if we do have some of those big partners that don't want to play by the rules of the game. And we've certainly seen more and more and more of these agreements settled over the past 20 years than we did in the previous 20 years. In fact, I don't even know how many are in existence anymore. One year I looked at it, it was 290, and then a few years later I looked at it, we're looking at closer to 400 and something. So they have been definitely used very often, particularly as we've seen all of the difficulties of making those changes at that WTO level.
Again, all of this seems to be full of paradoxes, where transaction costs at the WTO level, because it's a uniform set of rules, in theory is very low. But modifying the regime creates massive transaction costs, which then drives nation states to pursue alternatives, which are easier to administer, but because of the overlapping network of difference, actually creates its own transactional complexity.
Absolutely. That's just the way it is, isn't it? And some would say that the way the WTO is at the moment, it makes it very close to impossible to actually make changes. And it's even very close to impossible to make agreements on new things despite the need to do so.
In a sense, without this sort of shake-up or the jolt that has come from the unilaterally imposed and actually illegal tariffs coming out of the United States, you'd get the sense that countries are so frustrated with the WTO that they are looking for all of these subordinate processes to, in a sense, cope. But as we were touching on right at the outset of our chat today, again, paradoxically, what's coming out of Washington may well give new life to the effort that's required to bring the WTO a little bit more up to date. Certainly in spirit, if not in written code. And perhaps we could end this discussion with a little bit of a reflection from you as to what this might look like, or what are the issues that we need to be keeping an eye out on over, say, the next few years, insofar as the WTO is concerned, and global trade more broadly speaking.
The issues to keep an eye on. Well, one of the things that you've reminded me that I need to go and do is have a look at how many of those disputes have actually been initiated at the WTO level. I remember thinking they're going to be pretty busy forming all of these panels if these proceed past consultation. So that's one of the things. How many disputes are actually initiated at the WTO level, and how many are going to be there waiting to be resolved simply because we haven't had an appellate body to hear all of these appeals from those panel decisions? And what's that going to mean, and how are they going to deal with it? And look, one of those important disputes is precisely on the topic that we've discussed, which is the national security exception. It was deemed completely illegal at a panel level, these previous steel tariffs that were imposed. The excuse used then was national security. That was deemed to be completely against the spirit and the law of the WTO rules. And so it is sitting there waiting to be appealed right now. So that's one thing. How many disputes are actually going to be initiated there, and what's going to happen in terms of the appellate body? what are the decisions that are going to be made by these other members when they know that the appellate body has effectively been blocked by one key member of the WTO, being the United States. Now, that's not necessarily just the past several months. That's been going on for a number of years. How are they going to resolve that stalemate position? How are we going to move forward with our organisation that has been painstakingly created and agreed upon? The amount of time, effort, money, on a global level that's gone into creating this institution and the rules around it, how are we going to make it work so that we can resolve matters like those that we're facing at the moment through reasonable means, relying on international law, relying on certainty, and ensuring that it doesn't cause undue delay when it comes to things like resolving these trade issues. So that's one of the things that I think is going to be of a lot of interest, is looking at how we're going to resolve this stalemate, looking at the need to resolve it, which I honestly think we can see that just by having a look at some of the disputes that have been initiated and where it's going to move from here. Or are we going to see a lot of disputes initiated through these preferential trade agreements, the lower level agreements, simply because that's going to be another means to resolve things? I was interested to see if that was something Australia was potentially going to look at, asking the United States to enter into consultations under our free trade agreement. Of course, that hasn't been done at this stage, but that could be because I suspect that there's not that many upset people, politicians, corporations out there when it comes to that 10%.
Well, I guess we are living through a period of tremendous transformation. One of my takeouts from this discussion today is that perhaps the mono-dimensional view that the tariff wars is turning the world system on its head is probably missing out on some important nuances, and I think viewers would be well advised to perhaps think more thoroughly and deeper about how, in fact, often countries will double down on the institutions that have served them well today, despite the difficulties that they have. Look, Felicity, I know that your time's precious. You've got actually a lot of research now to do. So thanks very much for coming back on and giving us some insights against this unfolding maelstrom of change in the global trading environment. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to talk trade with you anytime. So it's absolutely my pleasure.
If you liked that video, please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.